Grazie ragazzi, willkommen and bienvenue to Cannabis Sciences live on LinkedIn. So, welcome back to our weekly appointment with the science around the medical cannabis. And today we will perform a live recording from the Cannabis Sciences Handbook, Principle of Clinical Cannabinology. This is the second appointment in which we read and discussed an excerpt from our handbook. Indeed, 2 weeks ago, my colleague Viola Bugnatelli read a chapter about multiple sclerosis, showing example of clinical studies with medical cannabis in this condition. Indeed, today we will go to paragraph 2.7 of our handbook entitled Insight Guidance on Delta 9, Delta 8 and THC and Delta 10 THC. And we will explore the science and also the commercial interest behind these two minor cannabinoids that are not extensively studied but have some properties that are very interesting. So for if you prefer to follow our reading along with the paperback copy of the handbook, you can grab your copy and join our reading. You can go to page 148 on the paperback copy to follow this reading, or on page 147 on the digital copy. So let's start with this reading. Before starting, I want just to show the index of our handbook Principle of Clinical Cannabinology. Here I show you the book again, the title. And this is a comprehensive guide on the world of medical cannabis. Indeed, for example, we have an introductory foreword written by Daniele Piumelli, that is one of the most influential scientists and researchers in the field of medical cannabis. Then we start with the paragraph with chapter 1, which deal with the physiology of the endocannabinoid system. So, in this chapter, we will explore the function controlled by the endocannabinoid system and its properties. Because why do we do this? Because the endocannabinoid system present in our body and in that of many animals is responsible of the therapeutic effects of cannabis and also of the recreational effects of cannabis. If cannabis has an effect on our body, is because we possess inside the endocannabinoid system. So knowing its properties and characteristics, and especially its component, it's very important to understand the role of medical cannabis in various medical conditions. Then we go to chapter 2, which deal with the pharmacology of the cannabis sativa plant. So here we analyze the pharmacology of cannabis and in a special way of its constituents, namely the cannabinoids. We will analyze the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic of THC and CBD primarily, but also of other cannabinoids that are, and also terpenes and flavonoids that are very important to understand the properties of the medical cannabis. Going on, we arrive to chapter 3, that is very important because here we put together all the conditions and pathologies that benefit from therapy with medical cannabis. We collected all the clinical studies around these pathologies, and moreover, that is very interesting, we asked to various medical doctors around the world who effectively use and prescribe medical cannabis to give us some example of how they deal with a particular condition. So we included a lot of case studies in various conditions with example of not only on prescription but how to get and arrive to a proper therapy by using various approaches that you can find in our handbook. And this is the chapter 3. And finally, we go to chapter 4, where we include the medical cannabis regulation, access and products in the European countries that open up to medical cannabis legislation. And before going on with the reader, I want to remember that this is the first edition of our handbook. We are preparing the second edition that we will be available for purchasing later this spring or the beginning of the summer. So stay tuned on our channel for future news about this. Moreover, I want to tell you that if you want to comment on this paragraph about Delta-8, Delta-9, and Delta-10-THC, you can do it by commenting on our LinkedIn page, and later on we will respond to your question. So let's start with our book reading. Page 147 of the digital version of the handbook. Let's start. So, inside, guidance on Delta-8 THC and Delta-10 THC is the name of the paragraph. The best known of phytocannabinoids is certainly Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, known simply as THC. Among the so-called minor phytocannabinoids are Delta-8 THC and Delta-10 THC, analogous of the more famous Delta-9, but with different pharmacological properties. So in this paragraph, we will analyze the chemical structure of these three compounds, and we will go to see the differences of these three compounds collectively referred to as isomers. We will see what isomers means, and then we will go to analyze the pharmacological and biological properties of these two substances. And we will go to explore the clinical studies in these fields. So let's start with the phytocannabinoids of cannabis sativa oil. The term cannabinoid is derived from the word cannabis. And now I want to, in this first sentence, I want to open up a blanket to say that in the term cannabinoid is implicit the word cannabis. So as with the name of the endocannabinoid system, both the endocannabinoid system, phytocannabinoids, endocannabinoid have the word cannabis in their name. This is because it is thanks to the studies done on the plant of cannabis that we arrive to understand that we have a system in our body capable of performing various tasks. Of course, the scientists named this system after the name cannabis, but this can create problems because cannabinoid and the cannabinoid system is associated with the plant cannabis, and this is not good because still today, in various parts of the world, there are medical doctors as well as patients, but also politicians that still consider cannabis just as a drug of abuse and not a therapeutic substance. And so linking the name cannabis to the endocannabinoid system make them think that it's something connected to a drug of abuse, and this contribute to the stigma still present around the plant. But let's go on. So until recently, it was believed that these compounds were only present in the cannabis sativa plant, namely the phytocannabinoids, but recently they have been identified in other species, such as in the rhododendron, in the genus Radula, in some legumes, in some mushrooms. So it was believed that cannabinoids was exclusively produced by the cannabis plant, but now it is clear that also other plant species and also other mushroom possess inside these compounds. But In the cannabis plant, we can find a perceptible amount of these cannabinoids, while in other species, these substances are present only in traces. But anyway, we can find cannabinoids not only in the cannabis sativa plant. The prefix phytos from the Greek phytos, an example plant, identifies their plant origin and serves to differentiate them from the cannabinoids produced by our body, referred to as endocannabinoids. So, endocannabinoids produced by our body, phytocannabinoids produced by the cannabis sativa plant. From a biochemical point of view, phytocannabinoids are classified as terpenophenols or also eicosanoids. Although in different ways, phytocannabinoids are bioactive compounds capable of interacting with our organism, in particular with the endocannabinoid system, producing psychotropic and or therapeutic effects. Currently, of the approximately 550 compounds identified in cannabis, about 150 are phytocannabinoids. The plant produces phytocannabinoids because they are needed for the plant's survival. So, the cannabis plant does not produce cannabinoids because we human beings can use them for therapeutic or also recreational purposes, but because plants need to defend against environmental stressors such as little bugs, but also bacteria, viruses, UV rays, and so on. So phytocannabinoids are produced by the plants to defend itself from external aggressors. Indeed, just as our body produces endocannabinoids to regulate homeostasis and thus survive changes, so cannabis produces phytocannabinoids to defend itself against exogenous substances and thus survive adversity. Phytocannabinoids serve as a defense against environmental hazards such as insects, pests, and adverse weather conditions. So they are produced for defensive purposes inside the plants. Now let's go to analyze the chemical differences between delta-8, delta-9, and delta-10-THC. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or simply THC, is the best known and most studied phytocannabinoid. It is naturally present in cannabis in concentration ranging from 2-5% to over 30%. Delta-9 THC is primarily responsible for the psychotropic and pain-relieving effects of cannabis. Cannabis also produces other types of THC, albeit in much smaller quantities, less than 1%, such as delta-8 THC and delta-10 THC. Both compounds are structural isomers of delta-9 THC. In example, they have the same molecular formula, the same number and type of atoms, but a different structure, a different three-dimensional arrangement of the atoms. So what is different is the three-dimensional structure, because these three compounds, delta 8, 9, and 10 THC, possess the same number and kind of atoms inside their structure. In particular, what differentiates these three compounds is the position of a carbon-carbon double bond. While in delta-9 THC, this double bond is present on the carbon at position 9 of the carbon chain forming the molecule, in the others it is present at position 8 or 10. And you can see these differences in the images here above. In the middle, you can see delta-9 THC, and you can see here, inside this red circle, there is this double bond that on the molecule of delta-9 has been found on carbon 9 inside the molecule, each carbon has a number. It's useless to explain why, but this one is on the top is carbon 9. So this bound is called delta 9, a bound on the carbon number 9. Indeed, on the left we have delta 8 THC, and you see a different position of the carbon bound, and same happen with delta 10 with this double bound that is on the carbon number 10. So you can see there is a very little difference between these two compounds, but this small difference make this compound behave differently in our body. And let's see why. Although this seems like a minor difference, and I was saying this, the position of this double bound changes the way these compounds interact with the receptors in our bodies, altering their affinity and thus their final effect. Now let's go to analyze the properties of delta 8 THC, properties and effects. Delta 8 THC was first synthesized from cannabidiol, CBD, the second most expressed cannabinoid in cannabis, around 1940, through a process known as cyclization. Cannabidiol was discovered and started to being studied in 1940 by the American physicist and scientist Dr. Roger Adams. He isolated CBD from the cannabis plant as well as other compounds such as the delta 8 THC, and he started to work on this compound trying to characterize their properties. But this work did not last a lot, because in that period prohibition was still in charge in the United States and also in the rest of the world. So it was not possible for Dr. Adams to study and work on cannabis, and so his research was abandoned. Nobody knew it for decades. Until more recent times, when his pioneeristic work was re-evaluated. Going on, yes, early human studies reveal that, like delta 9 THC, delta 8 was also capable of inducing psychotropic effects. In the 1960s, delta 9 THC was identified as the compound responsible for the psychotropic and therapeutic properties of cannabis, including alteration in mood, perception and cognition, and the pain-relieving effects. In 1966, delta 8 THC was also identified in cannabis products such as hashish, but in negligible quantities. Therefore, subsequent research focused much more on delta 9 THC. So it was found in the 60s, especially by the work of Raphael and Shulam, that cannabis possesses huge amount of delta 9 THC. They also identified delta 8, but in very small amount. That's why research focused on the main compound of cannabis that was and is delta 9 THC. However, delta 8 THC was the subject of study in the following decades. One of the reasons this compound has been studied is due to the better thermodynamic stability of delta 8 THC compared to delta 9, which makes it more manageable. Practice, it was found that delta 8 THC was more resistent to, for example, oxidation or degradation, even when it was burned up in the air, in direct contact with the atmospheric oxygen, and that's why it is more stable. So, in a certain way, it's easier to study compared to delta 9 THC. Despite almost 80 years of research, many people have the perception that delta 8 THC is a newly identified compound, probably due to the lack of hype surrounding these studies compared to those of the more famous delta 9 THC. Indeed, I've seen also some journal article that promotes or talks about this new identified cannabinoid, but it's not true. Indeed, it was one of the first identified. It was identified even before Δ-9-THC, but it was less studied. So, because in the recent year, Δ-8 has been studied and also used for recreational purposes, especially in the United States, there is now a certain hype around these compounds that make people think that it's a new compound, but it was discovered more than 80 years ago. The human endocannabinoid system contains two subtypes of cannabinoids receptor, CB1 and CB2. Various clinical studies have shown that the deep psychoactive effects of Δ-9-THC depend on CB1 receptor expressed in various brain areas. From studies conducted mainly in vitro, it appears that Δ-8-THC has a lower potency than Δ-9-THC against the human CB1 receptor and a similar potency compared to the CB2 receptor. So it has been found that both Δ-9 and Δ-8-THC are partial agonists of the CB1 receptor, and it seems that the affinity and thus the potency towards CB2 receptor is the same between Δ-8 and Δ-9. Why? Δ-8 seem less potent than Δ-9 THC when it comes to the interaction with the CB1 receptors. So let's go to analyze now which are the human studies on this compound. The first study on the effects of Δ-8-THC in humans dates back to 1942. I told you it was discovered by Roger Adams in 1940, and it was also analyzed primarily by Dr. Adams, who wrote also a publication about this. Indeed, Adams studied the effects of Δ-8-THC derived from CBD taken orally in a group of 77 volunteer subjects from a prison population. The subjects started with a dose of 30 milligram and increased the dose in 30 milligram increments every second day or every other day. When a non-tolerated dose was reached, the dose was reduced to the tolerable dose and the increment continued with the 15 milligram daily. Although a modern psychometric scale was not available, the reported effects were remarkably similar to those of Δ-9-THC. The psychotropic effects, but also the normal, or we can say therapeutic effects observed were apprehension, euphoria, loquacity, anxiety, reduction of the inhibitions, hunger and thirst, feeling of ache, inability to manage one's own body, uncontrollable bursts of laughter or giggles, drowsiness, languor, exhaustion, and a pleasant feeling of tiredness. So these are the first effects observed following Δ-8-THC administration in healthy volunteers. It was done in the 40s by Dr. Roger Adams, and as we can see, the effects are quite or totally similar to those exerted by Δ-9-THC. Subsequently, Δ-8-THC was tested intravenously, inhaled, and orally. So after this first pioneeristic study, there have been other studies that analyzed the effects of this compound with various routes of administration. And as we are going to see, the effects are slightly different according to the administration route chosen. Indeed, Talking about the intravenous route, in the 1960s, a comparison study between Delta-8 and Delta-9-THC administered intravenously showed that both cannabinoids have qualitatively very similar effects. Both phytocannabinoids caused a significant increase in heart rate and a significant increase in psychotropic effects, as measured on a visual analog scale VAS in the tested subjects. Both effects were mediated by CB1 receptor. So the effect after intravenous administration was similar between these two compounds. But the small number of subjects enrolled in this study makes a quantitative comparison impossible. However, it should be noted that the subjects reported a result on the VAS scale of 8-10 after receiving doses of 6 and 9 mg of intravenous Delta-8-THC. This indicates that Delta-8-THC has a maximum subjective effect very similar to that of Delta-9. This finding is consistent with in vitro functional assays on the human CB1 receptor, which generally showed a similar maximal effect between the two cannabinoids. So basically, when administered intravenously, Delta-8 and Delta-9-THC seems to have the same comparable effect. Maybe THC seems to be slightly stronger than Delta-8, but intravenously this difference is almost not existing. When it comes to the inhalation route, the first study compared the placebo with Delta-8-THC 10 and 20 mg and Delta-9-THC 5, 10 and 20 mg. Both the 10 mg and 20 mg doses of Delta-9-THC resulted in stronger subjective evaluation of psychotropic effects than the equivalent dose of Delta-8-THC. The 10 mg dose of Delta-8-THC resulted in similar evaluation compared to the 5 mg dose of Delta-9-THC, indicating that inhaled Delta-9-THC is approximately twice as potent as Delta-8. The second study evaluated an 8.3 mg dose of Delta-8-THC versus placebo and reported a highly significant increase in heart rate following the administration of Delta-8-THC. So, when analyzing the inhalation route, it seems that THC is twice as potent as Delta-8. Delta-9-THC is twice as potent as Delta-8-THC. But also in this case, Delta-8-THC seems to exert much or less the same effects of Delta-9-THC. Analyzing the oral route, in a 1973 study, the same one that investigated the intravenous route, an oral dose of 20 mg of there is a word I'm missing of Delta-9-THC caused stronger subjective effects than an equivalent dose of Delta-8-THC, 3.5 versus 2.5 on a global 0 to 10 rating. However, a higher dose of 40 mg Delta-8-THC produced a stronger subjective effect than the 20 mg dose of both molecules. This result would indicate that Delta-9-THC is 2 times less potent than Delta-8-THC. A later study in 1984, however, reported opposite results. But a dose of 50 mg than a 70 mg dose of Delta-8-THC had weaker effects than a 20 mg dose of Delta-9-THC. So when it comes to the oral administration route, results are not very clear. Indeed, there have been studies that showed that Delta-8 seemed much potent than Delta-9-THC, and another one that showed comparable effect. Just summarizing, also because we arrived at the end of this book reading, Delta-8-THC and Delta-9-THC have comparable effects. these effects can vary according to the administration route. But concluding, and you can find this conclusion if you go on reading this paragraph, the conclusion is that it seems that Delta-8 and Delta-9 THC have comparable effects, but with Delta-8 THC being slightly less potent than Delta-9 THC. Indeed, for example, people that consume this compound for recreational purposes always state that Delta-8 THC has a more pronounced mental effect compared to the physical effect exerted by Delta-9 THC. Anyway, if you want to know more about the properties of Delta-8 THC, and if you want to read something about Delta-10-THC, you can go on reading this paragraph found in our handbook, Principle of Clinical Cannabinology. We are at the end of this book reading section. I want just to remember you that we, in the next coming weeks, we will go on with the book reading. Both me or Viola will take excerpt from our handbook and we comment it with you. Again, if you have comments on this chapter regarding Delta-8 and Delta-9 and Delta-10 THC, you can write down on our LinkedIn page and we will answer you very soon. Thank you for being here with me also this afternoon, and see you next time with Cannabis Sciences, Principle of Clinical Cannabinology, and with all the science around medical cannabis. Goodbye and see you.